Watching your videos on your website, I find it, like you're saying, like you it seems like you really highlight the human part of it, where we could all relate to it. Is this what you look for when you look for clients, or when clients come to you? Like, what is your criteria, like when you're choosing a client?
First thing I always tell a client, and it's the one thing I make extremely clear: if you're not willing to be vulnerable, we're not the right fit. The only way that I can make them as human as possible is to show them in a very vulnerable state. And most people look at vulnerability as weakness. I look at it as a strength, because when you're vulnerable and you're open, it quickly creates a connection that says, "Oh my gosh, like I know that pain too." Right? Like I talked about struggling the first 5 years. For a while, I never told that story because it was painful. It was like I'm embarrassed to even say that I struggled for 5 years because I knew I didn't need to. But when I started sharing that story, what you realize is there's so many other people that struggled in their entrepreneurship journey and kind of went through the same thing. It instantly builds a connection. It removes the wall of here's this successful guy talking about how great he is, and it's more like no, he's successful despite the mistakes that he's made, right? Like if he can make mistakes and still be successful, I can too, right? And that's with Stefan. That's the story that we tell, where he was very insecure as a kid, right? He was in part of his story, he tells how he was seen as a fat, chubby kid, and he was very insecure because he felt like he didn't fit in. But here's a guy who didn't fit in at a young age and still is quite successful in his career now. And so that's the first criteria: vulnerability, being open to share who you are. The second criteria, though, is being purpose driven. This is not an ego documentary series. This is about inspiration and motivation, and being able to show people that there's not one way to do things, but if you can get over your own insecurities, you can do it the right way, and you can do it the way that you want to do it. So being purpose or mission driven, that's the other criteria, because I don't want to just point a camera at somebody that wants to show off what kind of cars they have or what houses they have. If you watch any of my documentaries, they're not that at all. But even though we may show a fancy house or we may show a fancy car, it's not about that. So that's the second criteria, is that they're purpose driven. The third criteria is simply being willing to tell their story in an authentic way, being willing to have a camera follow them around, and trust that I am going to show them in the best light. We're going to show the good and the bad. We're going to show the good, bad, and ugly, but it is going to be received in a way that people want to connect with you on a deeper level.
And it kind of brings to mind, and it just came to my mind right now, and it reminds me of this concept of the hero's journey. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was in high school, I had a teacher who kind of described it to me. And for some reason, when you were just talking about that, about vulnerability, it seems like they're successful, but then you saw their journey, and how they're vulnerable, and then it helps people relate to them and how they rise above that challenge. It kind of just brings me back to those days when I used to be a voracious reader, and I need to start doing that again. But yeah,
Yeah,
it kind of.
you bring up two great points that I want to highlight. So, hero's journey is definitely something that in the stories that I structure, is the way that I follow it. Right? It's so for people that don't know, the hero's journey is all about the person that you get really connected to, the person, the character. They have a desire, all right, but on their journey to wanting to fulfill this desire, they meet a mentor or a person that guides them on this journey. And then they go on the journey with this mentor, and you see their journey, and then at the end of it either ends in success or failure. And from that success or failure, they have be transformed and become a new person. That's the hero's journey. And if you think about anyone's story, that's what everyone's story is. It's the hero's journey, where we grow up and we have this desire to be, to give back, right? Or we have a desire to make an impact on someone else's life. And then we stumble along the way. We get started, but we stumble along the way, and then we reach a mentor, and that mentor, who's been there before, who's done it before, comes along and says, here's the right way to do it, and you go on the journey of doing it the right way, and then it either ends in success or failure, but that success or failure changes you, right? And it transforms you. That is the hero's journey, and that is when I talk about vulnerability, and I talk about being purpose-driven, and then I talk about just telling their story in an authentic way. that is the hero's journey. That's how it's the way I structure life. It's the way I structure everything. So yes, it comes off naturally. The other thing that you mentioned though that I wanted to highlight, um, gosh, you mentioned the hero's journey. It was something else that I wanted to highlight that you mentioned that I thought was really important. I think it was about. Remind me again, because I really want to. It was incredibly important that your listeners hear it.
I was talking about my it reminded me of like when I was in high school and
Yeah.
the hero's journey, how you overcome, how it seems like that people are successful, but then they have their lows and their vulnerabilities, and it shows how they overcome that hump, that challenge.
The other thing that you mentioned, I remember it now. It was because you probably didn't realize how important it was. It was reading. You said you wanted to get back to reading.
Yes.
2014, I started reading again, and I'd always been a voracious reader. So one thing I didn't tell about part of my story is at 8 years old, I was reading books, but I was also writing 100-page books of what I thought my future life would look like. And so I was always into storytelling. I don't know what got me into it, other than that I would watch TV crime show dramas with my dad, and that was always storytelling, right? Like that was always starting with the crime, and then the detectives go back and figure out why was this crime created, why was this crime, why did it happen, what was the motive. But so I've always been a voracious reader, but I stopped reading over time, and then in 2014 I started reading again. I put myself on a challenge of reading at least one book a month. At the end of that year, from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, I made 40% more money than I did the previous year. The only thing that changed was reading more books. So now, 2021, as we're recording this, I read at the very least, 60 books a year.
Thank you for joining me in this segment of the Free Mike Podcast. You can catch the full episode in Rumble, Minds.com, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoy my content, please consider leaving a like, Rumble, or subscribe for future content.